Before the scandals, before the courtroom drama, Sean Combs was the definition of the American dream. Born in Harlem in 1969, he grew up in a world of struggle. His father was killed when Sean was just a child, leaving him with a drive to never feel powerless again. Friends described him as ambitious, restless, always scheming about the next big move. By the early 90s, that energy pushed him into the music business. Starting as an intern at Uptown Records, Combs was no ordinary assistant. He worked insane hours, networking, scouting talent, and hustling like his life depended on it. And in many ways it did. But ambition can rub people the wrong way. Combs was eventually fired from Uptown. For most, that would have been the end. For him, it was the beginning. Almost immediately, he launched his own label, Bad Boy Records. The gamble paid off faster than anyone expected. Combs discovered and developed artists who would change hip-hop forever. Names like the notorious B.I.G. and Faith Evans became household names, and Bad Boy turned into a cultural empire. Sean wasn't just producing music. He was shaping an era. Soon, he wasn't just a producer. He was a star. He jumped on tracks, appeared in flashy videos, and turned Puff Daddy into a brand the world couldn't ignore. He was stylish, charismatic, and larger than life. Hip-hop fans knew the music, but the mainstream knew the man. Money poured in, but so did the influence. Clothing lines, vodka endorsements, reality shows. Everything Combs touched seemed to turn to gold. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, he wasn't just running a label, he was running an empire, and for a while it looked unstoppable. But with success that big, cracks were always just under the surface, and those cracks were about to widen. With fame and fortune secured, Sean Combs reinvented himself once again. He wasn't just Puff Daddy the producer anymore. He became Diddy, a larger-than-life persona built on excess, style, and power. Everywhere he went, the cameras followed. His all-white parties in the Hamptons became legendary, drawing celebrities, athletes, and politicians under one roof. It wasn't just a party. It was a statement. This is where the powerful gather. Diddy turned his lifestyle into part of his brand. He wore custom suits one day and streetwear the next, embodying hip-hop's ability to cross from the block to the boardroom. He was loud, bold, and unapologetic. Fans admired the swagger, critics saw arrogance, but everyone agreed. He knew how to command a room. Behind the scenes, the stories of his temper grew just as fast as his reputation. Industry insiders whispered that working with him meant long hours, high demands, and sudden explosions of anger. Some said it was perfectionism. Others called it control. Still, to the public, Diddy looked untouchable. He had his hands in music, fashion, television, and spirits. The Forbes lists labeled him a near billionaire. To many, he represented success itself, proof that a black man from Harlem could rise to the top of American culture and dominate industries once closed off. But power always attracts scrutiny. The same charm that pulled people in also intimidated those closest to him. Stories began to swirl about his relationships, his need for control, and the darker side of his empire. On stage, he was the life of the party. Off stage, there were shadows that fans never saw, and soon those shadows were going to step into the spotlight. Long before courtrooms and federal prosecutors, Sean Combs had a history of controversy trailing behind his success. To the public, he was still the champagne-popping mogul. But inside the industry, people whispered that power came with a dark side. Some of the earliest cracks appeared in the late 90s. In 1999, Diddy was charged with assault after an altercation with a record executive. The case was dropped, but it reinforced his reputation for volatility. Around the same time, there was the infamous 1999 nightclub shooting in New York, where Diddy and then-girlfriend Jennifer Lopez were caught up in chaos after gunfire broke out. Combs was later acquitted of gun and bribery charges, but the trial dragged his name through headlines for months. Over the years, more lawsuits stacked up. Former employees and associates accused him of unpaid wages, intimidation, and even physical confrontations. Most of these cases were settled quietly, disappearing from the news cycle almost as fast as they appeared. But the pattern was hard to ignore. Behind closed doors, industry insiders described a man obsessed with control. He reportedly monitored artists closely, blurred lines between personal and professional relationships and demanded absolute loyalty. Rumors circulated about parties that went far beyond ordinary nightlife, events filled with excess, secrecy, and blurred boundaries. Still, Diddy managed to avoid lasting damage. He had money, power, and influence. Settlements silenced accusers, his legal team kept scandals at bay, and fans focused on the music. For years, it seemed like he was untouchable, insulated by wealth and celebrity. But every empire has its weak points. As time went on, the whispers got louder, and the lawsuits more serious. The world was starting to pay attention, and the relationship that would ultimately shatter the illusion was already unfolding. With a young singer named Cassie. When Cassie Ventura first met Sean Combs, she was just 19, a rising singer with star potential, eager to carve out her place in the music world. For Cassie, meeting Diddy wasn't just an opportunity. It felt like a dream come true. He was a global superstar, a business mogul, and someone who promised to guide her career to the next level. At first, their relationship looked like the fantasy every young artist hoped for. Cassie had access to the best studios, the most exclusive events, and the glamorous lifestyle of a chart-topping star. Diddy paraded her at high-profile parties and industry gatherings, making her seem like both his protégé and his muse. On the outside, it was a love story wrapped in glitz and luxury, but beneath the surface the reality was very different. According to Cassie's own testimony years later, the relationship quickly became one of control and fear. Diddy decided who she saw, where she went, and what she did. He monitored her career choices and her personal life, often blurring the lines between support and domination. What began as mentorship turned into surveillance. Cassie described incidents where disagreements led to violence. One chilling account recalled how Diddy once beat her when she displeased him, leaving her shaken and terrified. Over time, the abuse escalated: physical, emotional, and psychological. Worse still were the sexual demands. During Combs's trial, Cassie testified that she was forced into drug-fueled sessions with male sex workers while Diddy watched or filmed. These weren't occasional incidents, but recurring ordeals that left her physically exhausted and emotionally shattered. She recalled infections, illnesses, and days of recovery, only to be forced into it again. "Sex acts became my full-time job," she later wrote, describing how staying in his good graces meant surrendering every boundary she had. The relationship lasted for nearly a decade, trapping Cassie in what she later called the most traumatic and horrifying chapter of her life. She said she felt like a puppet, her career, her freedom, and her safety tied to Diddy's approval. Every attempt to resist only tightened his grip, and while Cassie was enduring this reality in private, to the world, they still looked like a powerful couple. The mogul and his muse posing for cameras and walking red carpets. But the cracks were widening. Cassie's silence wouldn't last forever. By the late 2010s, cracks in the seemingly unshakable image of Sean Diddy Combs began to show. His empire was still vast, but whispers about his private life had started to spread. Cassie, who had endured nearly a decade of abuse and control, had reached her limit. For years she had lived under his rules, walking a tightrope between survival and destruction. She later revealed that she had nightmares, flashbacks, and constant fear of what might happen if she tried to leave. But something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was age, perhaps exhaustion, or maybe the realization that if she didn't get out now, she might never escape alive. Cassie quietly began to pull away. She cut down her public appearances with Diddy, started reconnecting with people outside his circle, and slowly reclaimed pieces of her independence. For someone who had been manipulated since she was 19, even small steps were acts of rebellion. When the split became official, it was framed in the press as an amicable breakup. Headlines treated it like another celebrity relationship ending, with little clue of the dark reality behind the scenes. But for Cassie, leaving wasn't clean or safe. It was an act of courage, done with the knowledge that retaliation could come at any moment. And it did. Cassie later testified that she lived in constant fear even after leaving, worrying that Diddy or his associates would retaliate against her or her family. Her words painted a chilling picture. "My worries that Sean Combs or his associates will come after me and my family is my reality. I have in fact moved my family out of the New York area, and am keeping as private and quiet as I possibly can because I am so scared that if he walks free, his first actions will be swift retribution." Despite the terror, Cassie eventually found strength in her own voice. She began speaking up, not only to prosecutors but also in her music and public presence. For the first time in years, she wasn't just Diddy's shadow. She was Cassie, an artist, a survivor, and a woman reclaiming her story. Her courage inspired others. When she finally broke her silence in a legal setting, she wasn't alone. Other women, emboldened by her bravery, stepped forward with their own accounts of violence, coercion, and abuse at the hands of Diddy. The private nightmare was now public, and once the floodgates opened, there was no turning back. When Sean "Diddy" Combs finally faced trial, the world was watching. Once celebrated as the architect of hip-hop's golden era, he now stood in a Brooklyn federal courtroom, accused of orchestrating shocking acts that shattered the carefully curated image he'd spent decades building. The charges were staggering: arranging interstate prostitution, violent assaults, coercion, and a lifestyle of drug-fueled marathons that blurred the line between luxury and exploitation. Though prosecutors had initially pushed for racketeering and sex trafficking charges that carried a possible life sentence, the jury would ultimately focus on violations of the Mann Act, crimes still carrying decades of prison time. From the very start, prosecutors painted Diddy as unrepentant, a man who thrived on control. They brought in letters from women who said their lives had been destroyed by his power games. They reminded the jury that this wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a pattern that stretched over years, hidden behind closed doors while the music industry turned a blind eye. But it was Cassie's testimony that left the courtroom shaken. 9 months pregnant, she sat before a packed room and laid bare the darkest years of her life. She described being beaten when she disobeyed, forced into degrading acts just to stay in his good graces, and manipulated through her career to keep her dependent. Her words weren't just accusations. They were the raw, unfiltered memories of someone who had lived in a cage of fear for more than a decade. Another woman, identified only as Jane, added to the picture. She testified that she had been pressured into sexual encounters with male sex workers while Diddy watched, and that when she resisted, violence followed. At one point, she recalled, he put her in a chokehold and struck her in the face. The defense tried to flip the narrative. They claimed Diddy was a changed man, that his time behind bars had humbled him. They painted him as a victim of his own addictions, suggesting that drugs and mental health struggles had driven his behavior. His lawyers even asked the court to consider a sentence as light as 14 months, arguing that he had suffered enough. But prosecutors fired back. He is not the victim, they said bluntly. The court should focus on the very real effects his conduct had on the lives of the actual victims. They pointed to Cassie's trauma, her nightmares, her need to uproot her family just to feel safe. They pointed to the years of silence, the fear that kept women quiet, and the power imbalance that had let Diddy act without consequence for so long. The trial became more than just a legal battle. It was a cultural reckoning. For years, rumors had swirled about Diddy's darker side, but few dared to speak openly. Now, under oath, the whispers had become undeniable evidence. By the time closing arguments were made, the courtroom wasn't asking whether Sean Combs had lived a double life. The only question left was how much of that double life the jury would hold him accountable for. And when the verdict came down, the world finally saw what happens when power, fear, and silence collide in the courtroom. The jury's deliberation stretched into tense hours that felt like days. Outside the courthouse, reporters packed the sidewalks, their cameras trained on the double doors, waiting for any hint of movement. Fans and critics alike flooded social media, torn between disbelief and grim anticipation. Sean "Diddy" Combs, once untouchable in the entertainment world, was now waiting for 12 strangers to decide his fate. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the air was heavy with silence. The foreperson stood, papers in hand, and began to read. On the most serious charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking, Combs was acquitted. Gasps echoed through the room. Had the superstar just escaped the harshest consequences? But the relief was short-lived. On 2 counts of violating the Mann Act for arranging interstate prostitution, the jury found him guilty. Each charge carried a maximum of 10 years in prison. The weight of that verdict rippled across the courtroom. Diddy's shoulders sank slightly, though his expression remained stoic. His legal empire, his freedom, and his carefully maintained image were shattered in that single moment. For his accusers, the verdict was bittersweet. He hadn't been convicted of every charge they believed he deserved, but at last, a court of law had held him accountable for something. Cassie, who had braved the public eye and testified while heavily pregnant, later said she felt a sense of validation, even if the scars of her trauma could never truly heal. Prosecutors moved quickly, emphasizing that guilty was guilty and that the crimes carried weight. They pressed for a sentence exceeding 11 years, painting Combs as a man who had shown no remorse and still tried to shift blame onto the very women he had harmed. The reaction outside the courtroom was explosive. Some longtime fans clung to disbelief, arguing that the music mogul had been set up or targeted because of his fame. Others, particularly survivors of abuse, saw the verdict as a rare and overdue moment of justice in an industry that too often protected powerful men. On social media, hashtags like "Wow Diddy verdict" and "Wow Justice for Cassie" trended worldwide within hours. Memes, debates, and heated threads dominated Twitter and Reddit. To some, this was the downfall of a legend. To others, it was the long-awaited unmasking of a predator. As the judge set a sentencing date, the music industry braced itself. Bad Boy Records, once synonymous with success, now carried a permanent stain. Brand deals and endorsements evaporated overnight. Radio stations debated whether to continue playing his music, while streaming services faced mounting pressure to address their catalogs. For Sean Combs, the verdict wasn't just a legal defeat. It was the collapse of an empire he had spent decades building. The world had heard the jury's voice loud and clear, and there was no going back. Friday morning arrived with a storm of flashing cameras outside the New York federal courthouse. Crowds gathered early, bracing for a historic moment, the sentencing of Sean "Diddy" Combs. For weeks, speculation had swirled. Would the judge deliver the harsh punishment prosecutors demanded? Or would Diddy's legal team succeed in softening the blow? Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Prosecutors opened with a powerful reminder of the crimes, elaborate, drug-fueled events that left women degraded, fearful, and permanently scarred. They pushed for a sentence of at least 11 years and 3 months, stressing that similar cases had drawn penalties over a decade. His crimes were not isolated mistakes, they argued. They were calculated, violent, and rooted in control. He remains unrepentant. Then came the voices of the women themselves, carried through letters read aloud in court. Cassie's words cut through the room like a blade. She described years of being trapped under Diddy's control, of being beaten, humiliated, and forced into acts that left her physically broken and emotionally shattered. From age 19, Sean Combs used violence, threats, and manipulation to trap me in over a decade of abuse, she wrote. Even now, she said, she lived in constant fear of retaliation if he were released. Her letter revealed the depth of her pain, infections, illnesses, exhaustion, the toll of a life spent as a puppet in Diddy's twisted world. Cassie admitted she had moved her family far from New York to escape the shadow of his power. If he walks free, she warned, his first actions will be swift retribution. The courtroom fell silent. Even those who had once idolized Combs shifted uncomfortably as the reality of Cassie's words sank in. Diddy's defense attorneys countered with pleas for leniency. They painted him as a man broken by his 13 months behind bars, a man who had endured constant suicide watch and had been humbled by life inside a Brooklyn lockup. They asked for no more than 14 months, arguing that he had already suffered enough. They said drugs, some prescribed, others abused, had fueled his violence, but that he was now determined to change. Finally, Diddy himself addressed the court. His voice, once booming with the confidence of a mogul, was quieter now. He admitted to mistakes but stopped short of full accountability, insisting that he was working to become a better man. Yet for many, his words rang hollow. When the judge returned with the final decision, the courtroom held its breath. Looking squarely at Diddy, the judge spoke of the seriousness of the crimes, the trauma inflicted, and the arrogance shown in trying to deflect blame. And then came the sentence, over 11 years in federal prison. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Diddy blinked, his face hardening as reality set in. His family wept quietly in the gallery, while Cassie and the other accusers finally exhaled with a mix of relief and lingering fear. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines blared, Diddy sentenced to 11 years, Cassie's letter shakes courtroom, fall of a hip-hop titan. Fans were divided, the music industry reeling. For some, it was the end of an era. For others, it was justice, long overdue. What was certain, though, was that Sean Combs' legacy would never be the same. The sentence had stripped away the myth, leaving only the man and the prison cell that awaited him. The moment Sean Diddy Combs was handed more than 11 years in prison, the ripple effects spread far beyond the courtroom. The hip-hop mogul who once commanded red carpets, dominated radio waves, and shaped pop culture was now branded with a permanent scar, and the world moved quickly to distance itself. Within hours, major corporations severed ties. Ciroc, the vodka brand Diddy had championed for years, quietly began scrubbing his image from campaigns. Fashion houses that once clamored for his presence at runway shows and galas released carefully worded statements about re-evaluating partnerships. Even streaming platforms faced public pressure. Should they continue featuring his catalog, or would playing his music be seen as complicity? The entertainment industry found itself in an uncomfortable spotlight. For decades, rumors had swirled about Diddy's darker side, yet few dared to confront them. Now, questions surfaced. How many people knew? How many turned away for the sake of fame, money, and hits? Former collaborators were asked to comment, with some refusing entirely, while others admitted they had heard things, but never imagined the full scope. On social media, the reactions were split down the middle. Fans who had grown up on Bad Boy Records classics mourned the loss of a cultural icon, some insisting he had been targeted unfairly. But survivors and advocates saw a different story, not the fall of a star, but the long-overdue unmasking of a predator. Hashtags like #Justice for Cassie and Buy Diddy trended globally, alongside heated debates that spilled across Reddit threads and Twitter spaces. Cassie's voice became central in the conversation. Her bravery, testifying while pregnant, sharing the most painful moments of her life, resonated deeply. Many framed her as a symbol of resilience, a woman who stood against one of the most powerful figures in music and helped bring him down. Survivor networks rallied around her, lifting her story as proof that speaking out, though terrifying, could change everything. Meanwhile, Diddy's empire crumbled. Bad Boy Records, once synonymous with innovation and dominance, was now tarnished. Younger artists under his wing scrambled to distance themselves, fearing their careers would be poisoned by association. Former allies, from fellow rappers to industry executives, either stayed silent or issued vague condemnations. No one wanted to be dragged into the storm. The cultural conversation shifted quickly. If Diddy could fall, who was next? Old allegations against other industry giants resurfaced, with fans wondering just how many untouchable legends carried secrets. Hollywood and the music industry braced for what felt like the start of another reckoning. For Diddy himself, the fallout was inescapable. His name was no longer tied to wealth, glamour, or success. It was tied to courtrooms, abuse, and the image of a man led away in handcuffs after a guilty verdict. His music would still echo at parties and on playlists, but the man behind it was forever changed in the public eye. And for Cassie and the women who had come forward, the fallout meant something else entirely, a chance to begin rebuilding their lives outside his shadow, knowing that for once the world had listened. Legacies are built over decades, but they can collapse in a single moment. For Sean "Diddy" Combs, a man who once stood as the very definition of hip-hop ambition, the question now is not what he achieved, but what he destroyed. On one hand, his accomplishments are undeniable. He turned Bad Boy Records into a powerhouse, launching careers that defined an era. His fashion ventures, liquor brands, and business deals made him one of the first hip-hop moguls to cross into billionaire territory. To millions, he was proof that a black entrepreneur could dominate industries that had long shut the door on outsiders. He wasn't just an artist, he was an architect of culture. But history will not tell his story in simple terms. His music, his wealth, and his business genius are now inseparable from the darkness that came to light. The court testimony, the survivor letters, and the 11-year sentence will forever shadow his name. For every platinum record, there is now a page in his trial transcript. For every chart-topping single, there is a victim's voice describing years of fear and degradation. Fans are divided on how to reconcile the two. Some argue that art should be separated from the artist, that I'll Be Missing You and Mo Money. Mo problems will always belong to the culture, no matter who created them. Others reject that notion entirely, saying his actions erase any claim to legacy. In their eyes, continuing to celebrate his music is to ignore the pain of those who suffered under his control. Culturally, his downfall is a warning shot. It forces the industry to reckon with how long power and money can shield abusers. It asks hard questions. Who else knew? Who looked away? And how many more stories remain hidden behind closed doors? For Cassie, and the women who testified, the legacy looks different. It isn't about Diddy's empire. It's about survival, about courage, about refusing to stay silent. Their willingness to confront one of the most powerful men in entertainment ensures that this chapter of music history isn't just about a mogul's rise and fall, but about the women who changed the narrative. As time passes, Sean Combs' name may fade from the headlines, but the story will remain a case study in how power corrupts, how fame can conceal, and how justice, though delayed, can finally catch up. His legacy is no longer a triumph of the American dream. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition crosses every line of morality. And that is how the world will remember him. Not just as Diddy, the mogul who once ruled the charts, but as Sean Combs, the man whose empire fell under the weight of his own actions.